Sure. Director Comey, I'd like to change the direction of my questioning specifically to issues of race in America. There's been a lot of talk recently about law and order, and you and I both, you in your position, me when I was mayor and had a city with high levels of violence and crime, really did focus on law and order, and it's critically important. But we make a distinction in America between law and order, which is a baseline, but we seek a higher level of standard, and that is justice. We pledge allegiance to this idea of liberty and justice for all. We look at our highest ideal is on the Supreme Court building, equal justice under the law. Now, in Birmingham in 1960, there was law and order, but there was a clear lack of justice. And many people complained when some rabble-rousers, outside agitators, came in, literally breaking some laws, actually, but exposed the fact that there was law and order, but without justice. Now, King wrote eloquently in the letters from the Birmingham jail about that distinction, really focusing on the difference between law and order, which he used Germany and other areas as places that had law and order but didn't have justice. We are Americans, and we strive for that ideal. Now, what frustrates me is 50 years from that time, we still seem to be dealing with a lot of the same issues. The Kerner Commission, put forth by Johnson 50 years ago, was seeking to diagnose why there was so much violence and rioting in cities, as well as nonviolent protests going on, and the report identified police incidents as the most common cause of riots and criticized the over-policing of black neighborhoods. Now, what frustrates me is that you read the Kerner report, you read the letters from the Birmingham jail, and you read your words, sir, your courageous words, and you see we're still struggling from those issues. Now, you gave a speech that I found amazing. I actually used your speech in my book that I wrote. New York Times called it an unusually candid speech, and for the record, this is what you wrote. When the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, the death of Eric Garner in Staten Island, the ongoing protests throughout the country, and the assassinations of New York City police officers, we are at a crossroads, you stated. As a society, we can choose to live our everyday lives, raising our families, going to work, hoping that someone somewhere will do something to ease the tension, to smooth over the conflict. We can roll up our car windows, turn up the radio, and drive around these problems. Or we can choose to have an open and honest discussion about what our relationship is today, what it should be, what it could be, what it needs to be, if we took our time to better understand one another. These are your words, sir. Much research points to the widespread existence of unconscious racial bias. Many people in our white majority culture have unconscious racial biases and react differently to a white face than to a black face. In fact, we all, white and black, carry these biases around with us. But if we can't help our latent biases, we can help our behavior in response to these instinctive reactions, which is why we need to work to design systems and processes that overcome the very human part of us all. Although the research may be unsettling, it is what we do next that matters most. You were incredibly courageous in this speech about talking about racial bias in policing. You and I both have an adherence to the idea of data. We have wild conversations in America, and sometimes I listen to it, and it seems like we're not even talking to each other. We're not leading with courageous empathy. But what I am frustrated about is, while I think we need that empathetic, courageous empathy to begin to create the understanding to heal as a country, we still consistently, 50 years since the Kerner report, based on data, have different standards of justice being applied to different communities in our country that is creating understandable tension. And frankly, if we saw the over-policing that the Kerner report talked about being done in other areas of affluence, we would have a very different reality in American politics because it wouldn't be tolerated. Now, you go on in this great speech to talk about specific needs that we have if we're going to correct this problem. You state, Not long after riots broke out in Ferguson late last summer, I asked my staff to tell me how many people shot by police were African American in the country. I wanted to see the trends. You wanted the data. I continue in your words. I wanted to see the information. They couldn't give it to me, and it wasn't their fault. Demographic data regarding police officer-involved shootings is not consistently reported to us through our Uniform Crime Reporting Program. Because reporting is voluntary, our data is incomplete and therefore is not aggregate, in the aggregate is not available. I recently listened to a thoughtful big city police chief. I stop here and say, you and I both know there are lots of police departments that are trying to do very good things about confronting implicit racial bias. There are a lot of good, thoughtful leaders in this country who recognize, like you do, that this is a problem. I continue in your words. Thoughtful big city police chief, his frustration with the lack of reliable data. He said people didn't know whether the Ferguson police shot one person a week, one a year, or one a century. And what the absence of good data, all we get are ideological thunderbolts, when what we need are ideological agnostics who use information to try to solve a problem. And you say he is right. And so I don't want to be here 50 years from now, or listening to my kids and grandkids struggle with what should have been done in the 1960s when thoughtful police leadership like you called for understanding this data of what does exist in our country, which is racial bias. And so I've put forth legislation saying, hey, let's get away from the ideological thunderbolts and get the data. We can't solve a problem unless we measure it. You're a manager of an agency. I was a manager of a city. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And so I want your opinion on basically what you've stated clearly on the need for national collection of data on implicit racial bias on police interactions with communities.
You could provide that as a written answer to that question?
Sir, that is, you allowed so many other people to go over. My time has just ended.
Not really. Not really. I'm going to ask another round, and you can ask another round. Okay, I'm going to keep this 7 minutes.
And Mr. Chairman, just for the record, it's ironic that I was giving a question about equal application of the law, and you did not equally apply the rules. If I can finish, sir, you literally even said to somebody, since there's only a few people here, I'll let you go a little longer. And right before, you seem to be incredibly strict with your application of the rules to me.
I cut other people off as well. Now you can ask the question.
I'd like for the record, the details of how long people went over, so I can point out to the chairperson how many minutes he allowed other people to go over. And then when I'm bringing up issues of race and equal application of the law, you suddenly cut me right off.
That's an absurd characterization, but now you can get your answer.
Sir, I'm not a characterization. I'd like that for the record, at least so you could see how you're conducting the hearing, sir. Director Comey, I'm going to finish my the last paragraph of your speech that I did not read, going back so I can heighten that issue of data. The first step to understanding what is really going on in our communities and in our country is to gather more and better data related to those we arrest, those we confront for breaking the law and jeopardizing public safety, and those who confront us. Data seems to be a dry and boring word. Without it, we cannot understand our world and make it better. Could you please comment on the lack of data in regards to policing in the United States and how hard it makes us to address the issue of implicit racial bias in policing?
Yeah, thank you, Senator Booker. This is one of the most important issues we confront in the FBI, I think we confront as Americans. There are all kinds of people of tremendously good hearts in law enforcement, not in law enforcement, in communities of color, protesting. Every single one of them is unguided by actual data and information. Every conversation, in my view, about the use of force and race in policing in this country is uninformed. People of tremendous goodwill trying to resolve these things. What we could contribute as a country is information to that conversation for the reasons you say, so that great people who care deeply about these things can come to solutions that are practical and just. We simply must collect data that is reliable nationwide about police use of deadly force in altercations, encounters with civilians. We simply must. If there is anything more inherently governmental than that, I can't imagine what it is. But we're now in a situation where we've got newspapers that are the only source of that kind of data, and their data isn't comprehensive. We are going to do this. I have spoken to, one of the beauties of a 10-year term is I am not going to shut up about this. I got 7 years to go. We will build a nationwide database that the FBI will collect that shows us what happened when, who was involved, what were they like, what were the circumstances, so we can have informed conversations. No one in this country knows whether the use of deadly force against any particular group, African Americans most particularly, is up, down, or sideways over the last 10 years. Nobody knows. Do we have an epidemic of violence? No one knows that. We could, we might not. We simply must gather the information so we can care deeply and solve these problems.
Director Comey, I really celebrate your leadership around this issue. As was said, the courageous speech you gave and your remarks right now. But the one thing I'll ask you, sir, is where we do have data, it shows an alarming fact pattern in our country. Not only the studies that you cite about implicit racial bias in your speech, but the Department of Justice has dozens and dozens of police departments, including the one that I ran, where I was even surprised at the data they collected to begin to create transparency. So police department after police department where we do now have the data is showing very dramatic, from New York City to New Orleans to Ferguson, showing dramatic biases in policing. So doesn't that lead you to believe, or that you see this consistent fact pattern where we have collected the data, that we don't just have a problem in the United States, to a nation that aspires to high levels of justice and equality under the law, don't we have a policing crisis in this country given the data that we do have?
I believe we have a chasm in this country that in many places where a divide is open and opening between law enforcement and communities, especially the African American community. It is the causes for it are complicated and long-standing, but not elusive. Right? We can stare at it. We have problems, things we can do better in law enforcement that are obvious, and we're working very hard to change. Where I think we can close the chasm is everybody wants the same kind of policing. Everybody does. Moms and dads and law enforcement want the same kind of policing. Up close, responsible, lawful, firm, but fair policing, transparent. We are safer when we have it. And the good news for America is there are a ton of police leaders who feel exactly as I do, and we are going to drive that chasm closer together because it's the way to save lives in this country.
And I'm going to appreciate and highlight what you just said. As a guy who ran a police department, we have incredible police leaders out there, the overwhelming majority who seek the exact same thing as the black community, as other communities, and frankly, who are under-celebrated in the level of daily heroism that they show in conducting their jobs. As I just mentioned earlier in my testimony, in my questioning about the 2 Linden police officers. But what people don't realize is that goes on every single day. People out there putting themselves in harm's way who do share our same values. But what you so astutely pointed out, that a lot of this is not conscious. Sometimes people aren't even aware of how they're not applying the law equally. And when I see Justice Department investigation after Justice Department investigation, police departments large and small, police departments run by African Americans as well as white folks, all coming up with the same set of data that's presenting the same fact that we do not have the equal application of the law. When we have prisons that are now full of folks that, whether it's Vermont, where there's 1% African Americans, but they have 11% of their prison population is African American, or states like mine, this dramatic unequal application of the law throughout the entire justice system. We've got to get to the core of this understanding of what can we do to begin to correct for this implicit racial bias. And I conclude with just saying, your prescription of having better national collection of this data, we cannot get there unless we first engage in an objective, dispassionate analysis of the facts and the data. And the fact that we don't collect them 50, 60 years after the Kerner report is outrageous and unacceptable. Thank you.